Duchess Sophie entered the private Windsor meeting expecting little more than a routine discussion about one of Prince Philip's surviving charitable legacies. Instead, the trustees placed a sealed folder before her and delivered an announcement powerful enough to leave the normally composed royal completely still. Philip's most guarded private honorary title, the distinction he had protected from automatic succession, had been transferred to Sophie personally, and the reason written beside her name made the room fall even quieter. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Sophie stared at the folder as if the words inside had rearranged the room around her. She had been summoned to discuss a legacy institution built under Philip's personal patronage, meaning his direct public support. She expected questions about charitable standards and future responsibilities. She did not expect inheritance. The senior trustee repeated the decision. Sophie had been chosen to receive Philip's most sacred private honorary title, a distinction deliberately kept outside ordinary royal succession so it could pass by personal judgment rather than rank. Sophie did not celebrate. She looked confused by the weight of it. "Why me?" Sophie asked, removing her glasses and setting them beside the sealed papers. The trustee held her gaze, then explained that this was not ceremonial kindness. Philip had left a private succession instruction, a written direction stating how the honor should pass after his death. He had rejected automatic seniority. He wanted someone who served without chasing attention, carried influence without demanding recognition, and stayed loyal without using closeness to the crown for personal advantage. Sophie lowered her eyes when a second page was placed before her. Beside the formal provision sat a handwritten note in Philip's own hand. She read it once, then again. The room stayed silent as the meaning settled over her. The title was not simply an honor attached to his memory. It was a test of whether the values he guarded most fiercely could survive without him. For Sophie, that realization changed pride into responsibility instantly. The trustees then delivered the detail that made the moment more dangerous. Philip had structured the honor so palace rank alone could never override his choice. Within hours, King Charles would be informed, and the monarch would understand that his father had deliberately placed one part of his private legacy beyond royal hierarchy. Sophie closed the folder, but nothing about the meeting felt finished. What stunned her as an inheritance would soon force the family to confront a harder question. What had Philip seen in Sophie that he had deliberately refused to entrust to anyone else? The trustees' decision did not emerge from one grand royal gesture. It came from years of small moments, quiet conversations after formal dinners, difficult engagements carried without complaint, and a relationship between Sophie and Prince Philip that rarely needed cameras to prove its closeness. Yet beneath that trust lay something more significant. Philip had watched how Sophie behaved when prestige was available to her, and, according to the private instructions now exposed, that mattered enormously. Sophie understood him. Prince Philip had little patience for ceremony without purpose, and he respected work that continued after attention faded. His personal patronage, the direct support a royal gives to an organization or cause, had always been rooted in usefulness rather than display. Sophie had learned that lesson through years of service, and Philip had noticed that she rarely pushed herself toward the center when someone else deserved the credit. Prince Edward knew that family connection had opened doors, but he also knew it could not explain this choice. As Philip's son, Edward had spent his life inside the royal circle, yet even he understood that his father separated affection from judgment. Sophie's distinction was not a constitutional title, meaning it did not alter rank or succession within the monarchy. It was personal. That made it more intimate, and more difficult for her to accept. Sophie finally admitted the fear she had been avoiding. Sitting alone with Edward after the trustees' meeting, she told him that accepting something so closely tied to Philip felt like stepping into a space that should remain his forever. Edward did not rush to comfort her. He reminded Sophie that his father never handed out responsibility because of sentiment. Philip expected people to earn trust, then carry it without turning it into theater. Edward's words broke through her restraint. Sophie's eyes filled because the title suddenly felt less like praise and more like a verdict written before Philip died. The private succession instruction, a written direction deciding who should inherit the honor, listed 3 qualities: discretion, independence from palace rivalry, and the courage to challenge family members privately without humiliating them publicly. Sophie had done all 3, though she had never known anyone was measuring her. Then one trustee added something that changed the meaning. Philip had tested those qualities personally years earlier. Sophie had faced that examination without realizing what was at stake, and Edward understood why the revelation unsettled her. She had not been performing for approval. She had simply answered as herself. To understand why Sophie's name appeared inside that sealed file, the story had to return to one private Windsor evening. When Philip asked a question nobody else in the room realized was determining the future. Years before the trustees opened Philip's instructions, there had been a dinner at Windsor that seemed insignificant at the time. No cameras waited outside, no announcement followed, yet one conversation at that table changed everything. Philip watched a disagreement over one of his charitable projects become increasingly political, then quietly turned towards Sophie and demanded an answer. She could have protected herself. She could have sided with rank. Instead, Sophie told him something nobody else in the room dared to say. Philip had grown deeply uneasy about one charitable initiative carrying his name. What began as practical service was drifting toward royal branding, with senior family voices pushing for more prestige, more ceremony, and greater palace control. Sophie understood the stakes immediately. A royal patronage, meaning public support given by a member of the family to a cause or organization, could bring attention and credibility. But Philip feared attention was becoming the purpose, rather than the tool. Sophie stayed quiet at first. She held no formal authority over the dispute, and the argument involved people senior to her within the monarchy. Philip noticed. Then, without warning, he turned toward her and asked what she thought. The safest answer was obvious: soften the disagreement, flatter everyone, and protect herself. Sophie did none of that. She told Philip that if he had created the institution to serve people rather than decorate the monarchy, then using his name mainly for royal prestige would betray the reason he built it. Silence followed. Philip did not praise her. He did not argue. He pushed his chair back, ended the discussion, and left the others wondering whether Sophie had crossed a line. She wondered the same thing. Yet later that evening, Philip asked her to walk with him privately. Away from everyone else, he told Sophie that titles become dangerous when people start believing the title matters more than the duty underneath it. That conversation became the point of no return. Philip later instructed his trustees to restructure succession to his private distinction. Succession, in this context, meant the rules deciding who would receive the honor after him. Seniority would no longer guarantee anything. Rank would not decide it. Character would. Stewardship would. And Sophie, without knowing she had been tested, had given the answer that convinced him such protection was necessary. Now the trustees' papers exposed what that Windsor evening had truly meant. Sophie had not simply inherited an honor. She had become the proof of Philip's rejection of automatic privilege for anyone inside the family. And once that buried conversation reached the king's private circle, an old difference over Philip's legacy suddenly became impossible to keep behind closed doors. There was no shouting when Sophie finally faced King Charles. That made the encounter more uncomfortable. The door closed, the aides remained outside, and between them sat the trustees' decision carrying Philip's name. Charles understood exactly what the inheritance implied. Sophie understood why he might resent that implication. Then the king looked directly at her and asked whether she genuinely intended to accept a title his father had deliberately prevented from passing through conventional royal seniority. Charles had already received the trustees' formal explanation, and every line narrowed his room to maneuver. Philip's personal trust arrangement, a private legal structure created to control how specific responsibilities and assets are managed, placed the distinction beyond ordinary royal discretion. The king could recognize the decision, but he could not simply redirect it. That mattered, because Sophie's acceptance could be read inside the family as more than sentiment. It could look like elevation. Sophie felt that danger before Charles said another word. She had no wish to turn Philip's legacy into a contest of rank, and she knew how quickly private meaning could become palace rivalry. Charles asked whether taking the honor would place her in a position she had never requested. Sophie answered quietly that refusing it only to make everyone comfortable would also mean overruling Philip's judgment. The king said nothing. He closed the folder slowly and looked away. That silence carried more pain than anger. Charles was confronting the fact that his father had deliberately protected one part of his legacy from the sovereign's direct control. Sophie understood what that realization cost him, so she made her own position clear. She would not use Philip's distinction as social rank, leverage, or precedence, the formal order deciding who stands ahead of whom at royal events. Sophie would accept only if the trustees preserved the independence Philip had demanded. Charles finally revealed why the matter could become even more difficult. Another member of the family had once expected to receive responsibility connected to Philip's private legacy. The king did not turn the conversation into accusation, but he warned Sophie that disappointment could harden into resentment once the decision became impossible to ignore. Sophie absorbed the warning without retreating. She had wanted peace, yet she was beginning to understand that protecting Philip's intention might require surviving discomfort. Then Charles stopped her before she left. There was one document, he said, that the trustees had not yet shown her. It explained why Philip insisted the future holder remain independent, even from the sovereign. Sophie paused. The confrontation had ended without hostility, but the real power inside Philip's decision had not yet been revealed, and that hidden clause would change everything that followed. The deepest shock was not that Philip had chosen Sophie, it was how carefully he had protected that choice. Hidden inside the trust arrangement was a clause written to prevent palace pressure, royal seniority, or even a future sovereign from turning his private legacy into another instrument of hierarchy. When the trustees explained the mechanism to Sophie, she finally understood why Charles had looked so unsettled, and why Philip had spent years making certain this responsibility belonged to duty, not power. Sophie listened as the trustees laid out the structure Philip had created around the distinction. The independent private body controlling it was not part of the crown's normal chain of command. It existed to protect his wishes from political or family pressure. Succession required a trustee vote measured against standards he had written himself. The reigning monarch could acknowledge the result, but approval from Charles was not required. That separation was deliberate, and Sophie now understood its significance. The distinction gave Sophie symbolic authority over specific projects tied to Philip's legacy, but it did not change her constitutional rank, the formal position she held within the monarchy. That mattered because Philip had refused to confuse moral responsibility with royal status. Sophie could protect his standards without becoming more senior than anyone else. Yet the lack of added rank did not make the burden lighter. In some ways, it made the expectation harsher. Sophie remained behind after the others left and admitted something to the senior trustee. The protection clause did not make her feel powerful. It made her feel exposed. Philip had effectively asked the future holder to withstand pressure from people they respected, loved, and lived beside. The trustee answered through a documented account preserved with the trust papers. Philip believed loyalty did not mean obedience. Sophie fell quiet, because she knew that principle could force her to disagree with Charles, Edward, or anyone else if the legacy demanded it. Then the real warning appeared. The hidden clause stated that the distinction could be withdrawn if Sophie used Philip's name for personal status, commercial prestige, or influence inside the royal household. A second provision went further. She was required to conduct an immediate review of every project still carrying his private endorsement, meaning his personal approval and reputation. Sophie understood at once what that could uncover: decisions made after his death that no longer matched the values he had protected. Sophie signed the acknowledgement anyway. The moment her pen left the page, the inheritance changed character completely. Philip had given her something precious, but sentiment was over. Within 24 hours, her first review would produce a decision that caught the palace completely off guard. Sophie could have spent weeks celebrating the inheritance before doing anything with it. She did the opposite. Almost immediately, She exercised the responsibility Philip had given her, ordering that every initiative carrying his private endorsement be measured against its original purpose. That single decision transformed a sentimental royal story into an active struggle over legacy. Inside the palace, congratulations gave way to nervous conversations, and Sophie discovered just how lonely preserving someone's principles could become. Sophie moved quickly because hesitation would have weakened the very standard she had just promised to defend. She ordered a complete audit of every project attached to Philip's private legacy, an audit meaning a formal review of whether each program still met the purpose for which it had received his support. Reputation alone would not be enough. Several palace-linked initiatives had operated for years under historic approval, and suddenly, that comfort was gone. The pressure followed her home. Prince Edward found Sophie late that night, reading old correspondence from his father, letters that carried the blunt expectations she now had to enforce. She admitted that she had imagined the title would make Philip feel closer. Instead, every decision sharpened the absence. Edward understood the contradiction immediately. The honor connected Sophie to his father, yet the work forced her to confront how permanently he was gone. Edward did not tell her to soften the review. He told Sophie she was doing exactly what his father had expected, refusing the easy version of loyalty. She closed one letter and admitted that understanding Philip's expectation did not make carrying it painless. The trusted confidant was beginning to feel the true cost of the distinction. Protecting a legacy meant risking the displeasure of people who had grown comfortable beneath it. For the first time, she understood that inheriting Philip's trust also meant inheriting the conflicts he had deliberately refused to avoid when principle was at stake for the family. Then the first internal finding landed. One program had allowed Philip's name to become promotional decoration rather than a guarantee of practical service. Sophie read the assessment twice before making her decision. His private endorsement, the personal approval linking his reputation to a project, would be suspended until reforms were completed. Senior courtiers were stunned. Sophie's first meaningful act was not celebration, expansion, or ceremony. It was restriction. Charles heard about the suspension before Sophie could explain it herself. The king knew the move would ripple through the household, and Sophie prepared for another confrontation. She expected questions. She expected resistance. By the time she was ready to defend the decision, Charles was already coming toward her. And this time there were no trustees, advisors, or folders between them. When Charles entered the room, Sophie expected resistance. Instead, he closed the door himself and left the paperwork outside. For the first time since Philip's decision became known, they were not speaking as sovereign and title holder, but as two people who had both spent years trying to understand a difficult, demanding man they loved. Charles looked exhausted rather than angry, and what he admitted next completely changed how Sophie understood his reaction to her inheritance. Charles asked for privacy because he no longer wanted trustees, aides, or formal papers translating what he felt. The sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch with constitutional duties, had spent days looking at Philip's decision through the language of authority. Now he spoke as a son. Sophie had prepared herself to defend the suspended endorsement, convinced the king believed she had moved too quickly and disrupted something the palace could have handled more gently. Charles surprised her. He admitted that his first reaction had never really been about Sophie's authority. It had been about his father. Discovering how carefully Philip had arranged the succession forced him to face something painful. There were parts of that relationship he had never controlled, and perhaps never fully understood. Sophie listened without interrupting. The king was not challenging her anymore. He was grieving the realization that Philip had still been making judgments about the family long after everyone assumed those judgments were settled. Sophie answered with equal care. She told Charles that she did not see Philip's choice as a verdict against him. To her, it was one final assignment from a man who gave different people different burdens, because he believed each person could carry something the others could not. Charles absorbed that quietly. Then he shared a private remark Philip had once made to him during a recorded family conversation. Sophie had learned how to become important without needing to appear important. That sentence changed everything. Sophie had spent days worrying that accepting the distinction might look like ambition, yet Philip had valued her, precisely because she had resisted that instinct. Charles then gave her the assurance she had not expected. He would support the independence of the trust, and he would not interfere with her review. Sophie finally felt the conflict loosen. For the first time, the responsibility felt less like a wedge and more like a bridge between grief and duty. The inheritance no longer seemed destined to divide Philip's family after all. Behind the closed door, suspicion had softened into understanding. But beyond that private peace, another storm was gathering. The story was about to become public, and Britain would soon begin arguing over what Philip had left Sophie, and why. By morning, the story was no longer confined to trustees, family conversations, and sealed files. Sophie's inheritance had exploded into public view. Commentators debated whether it represented promotion, affection, responsibility, or something even deeper. Yet all the analysis was eclipsed by one simple scene outside Windsor. Sophie arriving for her first engagement, connected to Philip's legacy, pausing beneath the castle walls, and visibly struggling with emotion when a member of the crowd called Philip's name. Sophie had already accepted the private distinction, but palace communications moved quickly to prevent confusion. The announcement stressed that constitutional precedents, the formal order deciding where royals stand within official hierarchy, had not changed, and no competing royal office had been created. That mattered because the inheritance was personal, not constitutional. Philip had entrusted Sophie with stewardship over specific parts of his legacy, and the public was suddenly trying to understand why responsibility had mattered more than seniority. Sophie disliked the way some coverage immediately turned the story into a contest for influence. She feared that endless arguments about rank could destroy the very meaning Philip had tried to protect. Before leaving Windsor, Prince Edward reached for her hand and told her she did not need to perform grief for anyone watching. Sophie answered quietly that she was not trying to prove anything. She only wanted to make his father proud. Edward understood, because he knew the day carried celebration and loss at the same time. Then one moment changed the national conversation. Outside Windsor Castle, the historic royal residence where Philip had spent important years of his later life, a crowd waited as Sophie arrived for her first engagement tied to the inheritance. An elderly spectator called out, "Do it for Philip!" Sophie stopped. She turned back, gave a small nod, and struggled to contain the emotion rising in her face. Edward watched nearby, and the brief exchange immediately became the defining moment of the day. That evening, a major broadcast shifted the framing completely. Instead of presenting Sophie as someone who had gained Philip's status, the program described her as the person charged with stopping his name from becoming empty ceremony. The distinction was subtle, but powerful. Public discussion began moving away from who had been elevated and toward what had actually been entrusted. Sophie's burden suddenly made sense to people outside the palace, and that left only one question. Sophie had been chosen, tested, challenged, and publicly embraced. Now she had to decide what the inheritance would actually mean. When she finally stood before the people connected to Philip's life's work, she would answer that question through one deeply personal choice. The story ends not inside a throne room, but in the kind of place Prince Philip would have understood immediately. A gathering of volunteers, young people, trustees, and workers who cared more about what a royal institution accomplished than what it was called. Sophie arrives carrying no ceremonial display of her new distinction. Instead, she carries one page containing Philip's principles, and when she finally explains what she believes he entrusted to her, the meaning of the entire inheritance becomes unmistakably clear. Sophie keeps the gathering simple. There is no elaborate investiture, the formal ceremony used to grant an honor, and no attempt to raise her constitutional standing. That matters because Philip's private distinction was never meant to rearrange the monarchy. It was meant to protect a standard. Charles attends. Edward does too. Their presence tells everyone that the tension surrounding the inheritance has finally turned into support rather than rivalry. Sophie pauses before speaking. An empty chair has been reserved for Philip's memory, and she touches its back lightly before gathering herself. Edward looks down. Charles remains still. Sophie admits that when the trustees first named her, she feared accepting the distinction might look like an attempt to occupy Philip's place. She now understands the opposite. Nobody can take that place. And the responsibility exists precisely because his place will always remain his. Sophie then makes the promise that settles everything. She says the title will never become personal prestige, internal leverage, or ceremonial decoration. Every organization carrying Philip's private endorsement, his personal approval attached to its work, must prove measurable service, independence, and usefulness. If an institution cannot meet those standards, his name will not protect it. The trusted confidant is not preserving a label, she is preserving the discipline behind it. Charles gives his support without qualification. The king's backing closes the emotional wound opened by the trustees' announcement. Philip's independence is preserved without diminishing his son, while Sophie's authority is accepted without becoming a contest for royal prominence. Edward's grief turns into pride because his father's expectations are no longer trapped in papers. They are alive in responsibility. And that is the final verdict. Philip did not choose the person with the greatest rank. He chose the person he believed understood the difference between possessing his title and protecting what it represented. Sophie's shock becomes duty. Charles's discomfort becomes respect. Edward's sadness becomes pride. Philip's final gift was not greater status or power, it was trust. Sophie accepts it without trying to replace him, and the family finally finds peace together. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.